So think back to last week then, and we said that Isaiah 40, through across into chapter 42, down I think as far as verse 17, it's a little book within the big book of the prophet Isaiah. And it's called the Book of Comfort. And the very first verse here in chapter 40 is God. Do you remember? He's in heaven. So you're invited to imagine God upon his throne, and the royal court has been summoned. And from there, God issues the command to comfort his people. And we saw last Sunday that God sends three voices out from his heavenly court. And these voices go to the people of God. They go into the world and they summon the world to listen to God. So last Sunday, we looked at the first 9 verses, I think, which was the introduction. And it makes no sense, maybe, but we're going to look today from verse 18 down to the end of the chapter. And what I want you to see is what we have here is a question and answer section. And there are 2 questions that are asked. The first question is, to whom will you liken God? How do you think about God? To whom will you compare God? That's the first question. And I want you to see that that question is asked twice. So the first time you come across that question is verse 18. To whom then will you liken God? And then the question is repeated in verse 25. To whom then will you liken me? It's the same question, but we have it twice. And then you get the second question. And the second question is in verse 27. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my just claim is passed over by my God? So we're going to take a look at both questions. And then the second question takes us into our text, which is verses 30 and 31. So the first question then is asked on the first occasion in verse 18. And as far as we can tell, it's one of the voices, those 3 voices that God sent out from his court. One of those asks this question. And the question is addressed to the world, to men and women everywhere. Verse 18, to whom then will you liken God? And I want you to see that that section goes from verse 18 down to verse 24. So it's a question, and then there's, if you like, answers contained in that section. And there are 3 parts to that section. So if you've got your Bibles there, take a look. Verses 18 to 20 is the first part. Then you have 21 through to 23. That's the second. And then verse 24 is the third element to the answer there. So the question, to whom shall you liken God? And I want you to see that what the voice goes on to talk about in verses 19 and 20 is how men and women invent God for themselves. And you have this idea of a workman, a craftsman, somebody who initially is rich and he's working with gold and he's working with silver, and he is creating an image of God. And then you can see in the verses that the voice thinks about those who are too poor to afford gold and silver. So he has this image of a person going out into the woods to find a fallen tree. And this person then looks at the fallen tree and thinks this is wood that will not rot, takes it home, and then hires a carpenter to mold that fallen tree into an image. And this is the idea that men and women create the image of God for themselves. They make God of their own thoughts, They make God of their own experiences. They make God out of their own resources, what's available to them, out of their own experience. Men and women create God for themselves. And so the question is, what do you think of God? And initially we see that people everywhere are busy making a God of their own thoughts, their own imaginations, and their own experiences. And the voice, as the voice describes this, the voice is full of sarcasm at the nonsense of men and women creating a God in their own image. And I'm sure all of us have had those conversations in which somebody tells you what they think about God and what they think God is like and what they think God will do. And all of that is an invention of God out of our own experiences. And then the voice does this. The voice speaks to the world and says, have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? And then the voice describes God. So the challenge is, men and women are making a God for themselves. But from the beginning of human experience, God has made himself known. God has revealed who he is. He has shown us what he's like. God has revealed his character and his person and his nature from the beginning. And so you've got this idea that the truth of God has been known, and yet men and women still make a God of their own imagination. So you have the truth of God clearly seen, and yet men and women burying themselves in the ground, making a God of their own imagination. And the voice then says this: God is the one who sits above the circle of the earth. God is the one for whom the inhabitants of the world are like grasshoppers. God stretches out the heavens like a curtain, and he spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. Now, here's a very important theme for Isaiah. And it's an important theme in the Bible. It's the theme of up. And so the voice commands the whole world to look up and to see the stars and the vast expanse of the night sky. And when this voice commands all men and women to look into the enormity of space, the voice says, God is the one who sits above all this. God is the one who encircles all that vast expanse that you can see. God is the one who stretches out those stars as if they were a curtain. God sits in the immensity and the vastness of his own being. And then the voice imagines God from that position of great glory, looking down upon our planet. And from the vastness of God's eternal being, he sees this world in which we live, and the nations of the world, and the people of the world as grasshoppers. That's what we are told there. So the first command of the voice in response to the question is to look up and to see God. And then the voice tells you in verse 23 and 24 to look down. Look down, says God. Look down and see those people of great power. Look at the princes of the earth. Look at the judges. Look at the rulers. Look at the presidents of the world. Look at how powerful they are. Look at their greatness. This is what the voice is saying. So as you look at verse 23, he's talking about the great emperors, the great kings of Isaiah's day. And this is what the voice says. God brings the princes of this world to nothing. God makes the judges of the earth useless. And that word refers to the plans and the schemes of the rulers of the world. And this God who is above the circle of the earth, this God who stretches out the stars, looks at these petty little princes and he says, I bring them to nothing. And then this section ends with verse 24. Scarcely shall they be planted, scarcely shall they be sown, scarcely shall their stock take root in the earth, when God blows on them and they will wither. Now here is God. We are beholding God and we are taking comfort in God. And I guess at such a time as you and I are now living, with all the horrors that are happening in Ukraine, all the talk of nuclear threat, Putin escalating his war efforts, the uncertainties that the world now faces, we are beholding a God who sits above the circle of the earth and who brings the princes of the earth to nothing. Now, what would this mean to Isaiah's fellow believers? Go to chapter 39 of Isaiah and look at verse 6. And this is what we find. Isaiah 39, verse 6. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. So Isaiah had earlier given this message that the people of God would be taken captive and go into Babylon. And so after giving such a sermon, Isaiah moves to the book of comfort. And he wants them to behold God. They are facing exile. They are facing being conquered and carried off to Babylon. But Isaiah's message is, behold your God. And that king of Babylon who will take you captive and you'll be exiled in his country, that king will be brought to nothing. Scarcely shall he be planted, and scarcely shall he be sown, when God will blow upon them, and he will be nothing. So you have this question then, the first time we see it. And then verse 25, the question is repeated. To whom then will you liken me? Now, what do you notice about the second time this question is stated? Well, I'm sure you can see for yourselves that this time it is God himself who speaks. So the first time we see the question, it's the voice. Here now is God. And God himself is addressing the world. And he says this, to whom will you liken me? Or to whom shall I be equal? Says the Holy One. So here's the second time we see the question, and this is what God says. Lift up your eyes on high. Now, do you see a theme here? It's the theme of up again, isn't it? Lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these things, who brings out their host by number, and he calls them all by name, by the greatness of his might and the strength of his power. Not one is missing. So God issues the question, and then we have this command again to lift up your eyes on high. And once again, now we are looking at the night sky. And we are seeing again the vast expanse of the universe. And it's the voice now who steps back in and says, look at that. But as you look at that, you see the God who created it. Now, today, I guess what we are finding is our scientists and our TV presenters, they look up, they look at the sky, and then they stop. They don't take that next step to think about who created it. And that's what the Bible's message is. You take the next step and you see who has made this, who brought it into being, who is maintaining this vast universe. It is the God by whose power and strength, by whose greatness, this great vast universe is being upheld. And so this second time we see the question, there's only an apt explanation, not one to look down. God isn't looking down here. We are not to look at the judges. There's this God who's saying, look up and see the vastness, see my might and strength, see my power, see my greatness. Now that's really important to hold in mind as we take the second question. Verse 27. This question is addressed to God's people. Why do you say, O Jacob? And why do you speak, O Israel? My way is hidden from the Lord, and my just claim is passed over by my God. Now, this is God speaking to his people through the voice. And God's people have been saying two things. They have been saying, first of all, that God has forgotten them. So if you look at that phrase, my way is hidden from the Lord, there's a sense that God has forgotten his people. And with that great sermon that you're going to be carried off to Babylon, you can understand, can't you, how God's people would start to say that God has forgotten them. He's left us behind. He's moved on from us. And then the second thing that God's people have been saying is this: my just claim is passed over by my God. And that's the sense that God's people had at this time, that God was treating them unfairly, that he had become an unjust God, that he wasn't interested anymore in the rights and wrongs of his people, the rights that they were having, the wrongs that they were experiencing. God is now somehow not interested. He's not concerned about our lives and what we are experiencing. So God's people were talking like this amongst themselves. And God had heard this, and God then asks his people this question. And I think it'd be really good for us this morning to let God ask us, ourselves, this question. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel? So God is saying this to you and to me. Why do you feel that you've been forgotten by God? And why do you think that God is no longer concerned about your experiences? And then you've got the answer. Now, these words are familiar, aren't they? Have you not known? Have you not heard? So what I want you to do is this. Whatever is going on for you, whatever your situation, and whatever you think about God, so you can think about God this morning in terms of your own life and your own experience. You can think about God in terms of our congregation. Has God forgotten us? Is God not interested in us? You can think about God this morning from the point of view of what's going on in Europe. However you think about God, this is what I want you to do. You begin with what you already know. Listen to this now. Have you not known? Have you not heard? What the voice is doing here is he is appealing to God's people to remember what they know. And some of you have said to me in the past, when you're in difficulties, you forget what you have known about God. Everything you've heard and learned seems to go out of the window. Now, here is an appeal in every situation, and whatever your circumstance, however you feel, whatever your thoughts about God are, begin with what you know. What have you learned before? This is the appeal of the voice. Have you not known? Have you not heard? And then the voice starts to remind God's people of what they know. The everlasting God. That's God. He is the everlasting God. What you know is that he is the Lord. He is your God. That term, the Lord, means the Redeemer God, the God who's chosen a people for himself, the God who has set up a covenant between himself and his people. It's the personal God. It's Yahweh, our God. Now, what you know, in whatever circumstance you're in, is God is your God. He has chosen you and called you and redeemed you and loved you and forgiven you. He is your God. He is the Lord. He is also the creator of the ends of the earth. Now that phrase, the ends of the earth, is repeated here. And it simply means, for God's people at this time, Babylon was the ends of the earth. They were going there. But God will be there when they get there, because he is the creator of the ends of the earth. And you may have heard commentators say this week, why should we be concerned about a country that is so far away from us? The ends of the earth. This idea of remoteness and distance. Well, God is there because he is the creator of the ends of the earth. And then we have these wonderful phrases, and we'll say more about these again. God neither faints nor is weary. God's mind is impenetrable. He gives power to the weak, and to those who have no might, he increases strength. So what do you know about God? You know that he's the everlasting God, he's the Lord, he's the creator of the ends of the earth, but you also know that he himself doesn't grow old or weary. God doesn't become tired. God doesn't reduce in his strength. God isn't overtaken by time. God is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. And what's God like when it comes to people? God gives power to the weak, and to those who have no might, he increases strength. What is God like? What do you know about him? God is the God who is concerned about the weak. God is the God who looks out for the powerless. He's the God who loves the needy. He is the God who has special concern for those who are insignificant. Not the judges of the earth, not the princes and the presidents. It is the ordinary and the everyday whom God loves and strengthens and supports. And then you get verse 30. Even the youths shall faint and be weary. The word youth there it's likely to refer to an athlete. Now, there weren't many athletes in ancient Israel, but this term seems to refer to those who now would be taking part, I guess, in the Paralympics, the youths. And then verse 30, the young men shall utterly fall. And the word for young men there is a word that would, I guess, be best translated as soldier. So you think of the Russian soldiers coming into the Ukraine and how mighty and how powerful they are. And here's the voice saying, even those athletes, what do we know about them? They shall faint and become weary. And what about those soldiers? They shall utterly fall. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. I want to say just two things as we look at these final verses. You have a vision here of the greatness of God, sitting above the circle of the earth, stretching out the stars like they were a curtain. God stretching out the heavens as if it were a tent for him to dwell in. Here is this apt vision of God, the everlasting God. Now, what Isaiah is doing is this. He's spelling out for you how great God is. His might, his strength, his power, his glory, his greatness. And as Isaiah paints this picture of the wonder and the might of God, he's telling you something. He is saying to you, this God is too big to fail. God can never fail. When he talks about growing weary, God does not, he tells us, faint or grow weary. This is the main message. God is too great to fail. And so if you forget everything else this morning, go from here with the confidence that God is too great to fail you. He cannot fail you. And all this talk about God giving strength and increasing might is God saying to you, I cannot fail you. It's an impossibility. So he cannot fail you as an individual Christian. He cannot fail us as his church. God cannot fail in his purposes. He cannot fail to blow upon the judges of the earth and reduce them to nothing. God is too great to fail. And then when Isaiah talks here about the youths and the young men, what he's saying there is this. Life's experience shows us things. What does life show us? So your life, my life, what will life show us now? What will experience show us as we look at the Ukraine and Russia? What we are seeing is heroism and courage, and we are seeing desperation and horror and death and suffering. We're seeing all that, aren't we? We are seeing how apparently this great column of Russian troops has stalled, not progressing as we imagined. Experience tells us that there is weakness and failure. So let me bring it back to the verse. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and the young men utterly fall. You know enough about life from your experience to know that there is weakness and struggle and failure. That's what we know. That's what life has taught us. That the best laid plans come to nothing. That violence is all around us. This is what life teaches us. So I want you to bring to mind what life has taught you and me. What's your life experience? And this idea of youths and young men, power and strength, even athletes, even soldiers, don't achieve what they want. Now that's the idea here, okay? Life's experience shows you that there can be weakness and failure. And then most wonderfully in verse 31, Isaiah comes along and he shows God's people that a different experience is available to us. God's people are offered by God a different life's experience. And God, as he announces that his people will be carried off to Babylon, as God says, lift up your eyes on high, see who has made all these things, see the one who sits above the circle of the earth, God offers a different life experience. And what I want to be very clear about, I don't know how you can tell me, but I want you all to be very clear that what we are dealing with here is a different life experience compared to the one that we all know. So your life experience may have taught you that you grow old and you become weak. Your life experience may tell you that there is failure and discouragement. And life may have taught you that things are uncertain and that you can't ever know. Whatever life has shown you is summed up in verse 30. But then comes this great message that a different life experience is available to the people of God. And here it is. Those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Now, what the end of verse 31 does is this. It contradicts life's experience. It's impossible for a human being to sprout the wings of an eagle and rise up. It is impossible in human experience to run without ever becoming weary. And it's impossible in human experience to walk without becoming faint. So this is a different experience, a different life experience for the people of God. And how is it possible? They who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. So what I want to do is this. Next Sunday, all being well, I want us to look at in more detail, what is this new life experience that God offers his people? What does it mean to wait on the Lord? What does it mean to renew your strength? So how can you and I, beholding our God, sitting above the circle of the earth, while the princes of this world are there in their power, how can we learn a different life experience? Well, let's pray. Lord, you are the God who sits above the circle of the earth. You are the God who stretches out the heavens like a curtain. Lord, by the greatness of your power, not one is missing. You call all the stars by their name, and you've invited us today